Well, today on Unbelievable, we're asking, how did St. Paul change the world? NT Wright, or Tom Wright as he's popularly known, is one of the world's most influential Bible scholars, and his new book, Paul, a Biography, is a detailed study of the apostle who brought Christianity from Jerusalem to the rest of the world. St. Paul's influence is almost incalculable, perhaps second only in the world to Jesus Christ himself, as he took the good news of a Jewish Messiah to the Roman Empire that ruled the world. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks has described Tom Wright's book as an enthralling journey into the mind of Paul by one of the great theologians of our time, a work full of insight, depth and generosity of understanding. So it's pretty good when you can get endorsements like that on your book jacket. Opposite Tom Wright for today's discussion is another Tom Holland, a popular historian whose best-selling books such as Rubicon and Dynasty have told the story of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. While not a believer himself, Tom Holland is also working on a new book on the way that Christianity became the most revolutionary force for changing the world. And it'll be interesting to hear how you've been getting on in that endeavour, Tom. Today, though, is really an exchange, a collegial discussion between two people who are simply fascinated in this era of history. What can we know from Acts and the letters in the New Testament about Paul? What are the gaps that we need to fill in about who he was and how he went about his mission? And we'll talk, of course, about his famous conversion and the unique way his theology developed as he brought Jewish monotheism and Jesus the Messiah together. So Tom Holland and Tom Wright, welcome along to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to have you both joining me today. We'll come to you first of all, Tom Wright. I'm probably going to have to use surnames just to distinguish you both today. But so you've been writing and researching Paul for decades now, haven't you?
Yes.
I mean, a couple of years ago, I had you on when you wrote your magnum opus, which was...
That's actually amazing. That's 5 years ago that came out. Yeah, isn't that extraordinary? It's gone quickly.
The two-volume, sort of very academic
Paul and the
work.
Faithfulness of God, yes.
And is this really, I suppose, in a sense, the popular level version of what you wrote then?
Sort of yes and no. When I did that big book, several people, both including colleagues in the discipline, said, wish you'd do a shorter one. Of course, part of the point of the longer one was that I've been writing shorter things and articles, and people had always said, yeah, but you didn't explain this, or yes, but surely that has to be contextualized there. Okay, you want the big thing, here it is. And then, of course, they all said, oh, it's far too long. So it's as Jesus said, you know, we danced for you and we wouldn't sing, and we wept and you wouldn't mourn. But this isn't exactly a potted down version, because that was a book on Paul's mind and theology. Now, there's a lot of mind and theology in here, but part of the whole point of it is that what Paul was thinking and saying was contextualized in a rich, multi-layered life, which was to do with both his Jewish upbringing and his amazing knowledge of the Jewish scriptures, and with his contextualizing in the Roman world, where he was a citizen, and in the Greek world, where he knew his Epicureans from his Stoics.
Yes.
And we see Paul navigating these things in a multi-layered way, which I find just perpetually enthralling, because I grew up with a Paul who was basically a brain box who said prayers, as it were, and then the rest of it was sort of off on the side. And the older I've got, the more the whole man speaks to this whole man, and that's been really exciting.
You probably feel like you know his era almost as well as you know your own now, Tom.
Well, let's put it like this. My students mock me because when I say the war, I mean the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70, not World War I or II. And they say, well, so, yeah, I sort of mentally live in the first century, though I've tried to diversify more recently and get back towards our day as well.
And just kind of give us a sense of how you structure this particular, because you've called it, Paul, a biography, and in that sense, you are trying to write something that's sort of a narrative of his life. It's not a sort of academic book in the traditional sense.
No, it's not at all. I mean, the only footnotes are basically references to bits of the Bible or bits of classical sources and so on. So there's no discussion of other scholarly views, or if I do say there are various views here, I don't actually go into detail as to who said it. You can find those elsewhere. So this is going through from what we know about or can infer about his early life and how he got to the point where he was on the road to Damascus when ... and then what happened next. And As with virtually all ancient history, there are gaps, and that's quite normal. But when you have gaps in any narrative, ancient or modern, what you can do is probe cautiously from either side, as it were, the bits you do know, and say, well, it's possible this, it's likely that, or it's almost certain that, such and such. And that's what I try to do to construct
something
a
of a
whole
gift
story
to us 2,000 years later, that he was obviously a prolific letter writer.
Well, he comparatively prolific, but actually the letters are short. How many volumes do we have of Cicero's letters in the Lerb classics? I mean, just that's,
they go on and on.
They go exactly.
Have you read them all?
Exactly. They do go on and they're fascinating, and they shed a flood of light on all sorts of things in first century BC Roman culture. But for Paul, we've just got these snippets because he's writing on the go. He's not leisured, sitting there with all day to compose. He's really sending bulletins from the front, as it were. Yes. So most of his time he isn't writing letters, so far as we know. He's talking with people, he's preaching, he's praying, he's trying to organise these little communities, and then from time to time he has to buzz off a letter to somebody. Yeah.
And you're always obviously hearing one side of the conversation, and you sort of have to fill in gaps, and you have to, I suppose, as a historian, Tom, what you're doing as well is saying, well, here's what we know was going on in the wider culture, and that makes sense of why Paul said this and did this.
And particularly, I mean, I am very fortunate in that I kind of came of age as a scholar just when the contemporary revolution in modern Jewish studies was happening, so that we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls in good modern editions, we've got new good editions of Josephus, we know much, much more about the early rabbis than we did 50 years ago because of massive work that's gone on. So we can reconstruct quite a lot about how Jews in that period were thinking. And of course that's controversial too, but we can see a big picture within which then the way Paul is going after things makes sense if you say take somebody in that world who is also very much alive to the Greek and Roman context, but who then happens to believe that God has fulfilled his promises by sending a Messiah who was then crucified. That's bizarre, but the sense Paul makes of it is the sense that it would make within that Jewish world.
And just before we come to Tom Holland here, that was going to be my next question, was will people reading this book simply know a lot more about Paul by the end of it, or will it give us a better picture of Jesus, the person he was obviously speaking of?
I'm not sure it would necessarily give you a better picture of Jesus, but it would give you a better picture of how the very first followers of Jesus were wrestling with the question, what does it mean that God's Messiah was crucified and raised from the dead? That's not part of the game plan, but if that's what we've got, how does that reconfigure everything? Obviously, I and many others have written quite a lot about Jesus as well. That's another story. But it's probing back. And I mean, for me, I just go on being fascinated by the fact that within, I would say, 20 or so years of the crucifixion, here is a highly intelligent man saying he loved me and gave himself for me. That is extraordinary. Yes. It's hard to imagine anybody saying that about anybody else in the last 20 years, unless all sorts of other things were true as well. And yet, Paul says it.
Tom Holland, thank you for joining us on the programme today. We've thrown you in at the deep end.
You really
Your
have.
first discussion on St Paul.
I know.
And it's
with Tom Wright. The terror.
Well, thank you for putting yourself in the opposite chair. As I say, this isn't. Sometimes this programme is combative. I have a feeling that won't be the case today. It'll very much be a meeting of minds. But tell us where your interest in the whole classical age really began. You've sort of been doing this all of your adult working life, haven't you?
Well, it goes right the way back to childhood, and I was the kind of child who loved dinosaurs. I liked them because they were big and they were fierce and they were glamorous and they were extinct. And my interest I suppose, in the Roman army and then by extension the Roman
is of
Empire.
A similar nature.
Well, it was a seamless movement from Tyrannosaurus Rex to Caesar. And so the kind of the glamour and the beauty and the power and the cruelty of the Greeks and the Romans I found very appealing. Yeah. And in contrast to that, although I went to Sunday school and I was very, very interested in biblical history as well, I found them all a bit po-faced, kind of. I didn't like their beards. I preferred kind of the clean-shaven look of Apollo, and so in a way I was kind of seduced by the glamour of Greece and Rome, I suppose. And so the first books I wrote about of history were about Greece and Rome, and in many ways the appeal particularly, I think, of Rome is that in certain ways they do seem very like us. So you were talking about Cicero's letters, and this is a man who, is worrying about property prices. He's worrying about the weather. He's bitching about
Sounds
people.
very British to me.
Yeah, so in all kinds of ways he seems very familiar.
Yes.
But the more you live in the minds of the Romans, and I think even more the Greeks, the more alien they come to seem, the more frightening they come to seem. And what becomes most frightening really is a kind of quality of callousness that I think is terrifying because it is completely taken for granted. There's a kind of innocent quality about it. Nobody really questions it.
And what sort of form did that take?
Well, if we're in the age of Cicero, Cicero's great contemporary Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of promoting it. And so when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards, boasting about how many people he's killed. And this is a really terrifyingly alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it is built on systematic exploitation. So the entire economy is founded on slave labor.
Right.
The sexual economy is founded on the absolute right of free Roman males to have sex with anyone that they want, any way that they like. And in almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more, and it was kind of like I was thinking, well, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch, you get on your back and you can't find it. And this was then enhanced for me by then writing a book about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam from the late religious the religious and imperial context of late antiquity, and again finding in Islam a profound quality of the alien. That there were aspects of Islam that were very familiar, but there were many aspects of it that again seemed deeply, deeply alien. And I began to realize that actually, in almost every way, I am Christian. And I began to realize that actually Paul, although in many ways he seems a much less familiar figure than Cicero, the kind of urbane man with his property problems. Paul never had any property; he just made tents. Yes. That in almost every what is it, seven, that is the 7 letters that are people conventionally people absolutely accept that and as Tom Wright was saying, this is not a very lengthy amount of writing, but compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world.
Well, the Western world, as we take for granted. Yes,
but also the way that the West has then moved on to shape, concepts like international law, for instance. So the concepts of human rights, all these kind of things, ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul.
Some of the humanists and atheists,
his letters, I think, are, along with the 4 Gospels, the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world.
When you penned that article, I think it was for the New Statesman, where you said what I got wrong, and you sort of came out, as it were, and said, as far as my values and background are concerned, I am a Christian. It was interesting to see the response to that, because I saw lots of atheists and humanists saying, "Oh, hang on, democracy, that goes back to the Greeks. Don't pretend that Christianity gave us everything we're grateful for." But you honestly think that actually people simply haven't appreciated just how much we owe to the Judeo-Christian?
I think. I mean, if we're talking of Paul, I think of him as a kind of depth charge, deep beneath the foundations of the classical world, and it's not anything that you particularly notice if you're, in Corinth or Alexandria. And then you start feeling this kind of rippling outwards. And, by the time you get to the 11th century in Latin Christendom, everything has changed. And you have this, I think essentially what Paul's significance is that he sets up ripple effects of revolution throughout Western history. So the 11th century, where with the Papal Revolution, essentially it establishes this idea that society has to be reborn, reconfigured, that vested interests have to be torn down. And then the Reformation, what we call the Reformation, is a further ripple effect of that, and the Enlightenment is a further ripple effect of that. And
very interesting.
It spilled out so much that now in the 21st century we don't even realise where these ripple effects are coming from. We just take them for granted.
I can hear Tom Wright. You want to come in and
just thinking.
this.
I haven't actually read from cover to cover, but Stephen Pinker's 2 books where he's saying effectively.
Well, I had him on the show quite recently.
Oh, really?
Yes,
okay.
On,
but
on
he's saying,
yes.
Forget all that religion stuff. We invented the real world as it should be in the Enlightenment, and all we have to do is apply that more and more rigorously, and just kick that religion stuff into touch. And it's very interesting that some commentators have said, well, if that was going to be the case, it would work in America better than anywhere else. And look at America and what's actually happening, and you'll see that it doesn't. But I think I want to respond with what Pope Benedict said 10 years ago when he was speaking at the United Nations, when he said that the whole idea of human rights is absolutely rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if you try and get the fruits of that without the roots, all you'll get is the thing will collapse into shrill special interest rhetoric, everyone claiming the status of victim and
now,
shouting
when I
stuff,
had
which is exactly what we
well,
are.
of course, but the power of victimhood is again something that is part of the revolutionary inheritance of Christianity.
Yes.
Because that is the point of the crucifixion.
And nobody in Caesar's world would have said, "Oh, I'm a victim, therefore I've got to be prioritised."
So Paul calls it a scandal.
But when I had
absolutely.
Stephen Pinker in the very chair
Yes,
you're
yes.
sitting in right now, Tom Wright, his response to this argument, which at this point was being put by Nick Spencer, who's written a very good book as well on the evolution of the West, making this very argument. His argument was, no, but, okay, Christians may have given us some good principles, but all we need to recognise is our universal humanity, that we're part of the same species, we're all sentient. That gives us every grounding we need for treating each other with dignity and human rights.
And who thought like that in the first century? I mean, Paul talking about Adam and Christ, basically.
So are you saying that kind of a belief doesn't simply emerge from a vacuum in a sense?
Yeah, the idea of a universal humanness is something that actually, even in the 18th century, they struggled with. When missionaries went to America and came back arguing about whether the American Indians had souls or not.
Right.
Were they really the same species as us? And then John Wesley and George Whitefield and so on saying, no, these people have to be taught to love God like any of us. And so there's stuff going on there which is, again, rooted in the Christian
and you're
faith.
part of the pushback on this in a way, aren't you?
I mean, it seems to me that the single most influential phrase for understanding why we have a notion of a kind of common humanity is in Galatians, where Paul says, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, and there you have this idea that we are, of course, he goes on to say, in Christ Jesus, and that for the contemporary world is, we just.
That's the bit people want to do without.
But of course, there is an issue there, as Daniel Boyarin, in a fascinated Jewish scholar writing about Paul, says, so Jewishness and Greekness gets dissolved into this universal humanity. But what if I, as a Jew, want to stay a Jew? And so, in a sense, there also you have the kind of, the issues that continue to obsess our society, which is essentially, if you don't want to be part of a kind of universal commonality, what then do you do?
The dangerous thing, I was at a conference in America a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, based on the big book on Paul, and there was an African-American theologian, a woman at Fuller Seminary, who basically pushed back at me on this and said, the danger is that when you say we're all one in Christ Jesus, what that means is that everyone else is an honorary white male,
right.
And the white males have got it, and that everyone else has to say, okay, we're sort of part of your team, as it were. And I said, if that's what you're hearing, that's certainly absolutely not what I was intending, and it's certainly not what Paul was intending either. And I know Danny Boyarin, and we've had this debate. It's great fun, because I think what we're seeing there is a very interesting cultural moment on the cusp of modernity and postmodernity. And David Horrell in Exeter, his book on Paul, Solidarity and Difference, says it all, that on the one hand, we've got this cultural drive towards we're all part of it's what's going on with the Europe debate at the moment.
Yeah.
Solidarity. We're all just part of this nice big family, and that's how it all works in economy of scale and so on. And then lots of people, including in Scotland where I now live, saying, no, that's squelching our identity and we're not going to let you do it.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that Paul, in, say, 1 Corinthians, is faced with the same issues. How do you navigate pastorally and theologically where you're simultaneously saying we've all got to be one family, and then you're saying, but if your conscience means that this is where you are at the moment, here's how we live with that and how we have to respect that. And he's basically wrestling with the big issues that we're wrestling with as well, doing so very sophisticatedly.
Let's come to some of his specific story, because you do a fabulous job in the opening chapters of the book in setting the scene of who Paul was, what we can know about his background, the sort of Judaism that he came from. And for me, one of the fascinating bits was you kind of speculating on what he might have been thinking about when he was on that famous road to Damascus, because I thought that was quite interesting. You know, what was occupying Paul's mind at the moment when that famous event occurred? So do you want to just walk us through that? Because I think this is probably the most famous conversion in all of history, in a way.
Yes, if conversion is the right word. Right. And let me say...
that's the key.
Well, but right off the top, the danger with saying conversion is that what that word means in our world, if I say so-and-so just got converted, the chances are this means that so-and-so was probably an atheist or an agnostic, and they have now found some sort of faith. And one would hope it might, for me, it might be a Christian faith. That's not really at all what's going on for Paul, and it's certainly not about swapping from one religion to another. That's the layers of misunderstanding there in terms of what the word religion meant in the ancient world, in terms of what the word religion means in our world. Neither of those fit what's happening to Paul. Paul always had believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the creator God. He never for a moment stopped believing in that God. He was living in a narrative which said, all those ancient promises have got to come true. God's got to show that he's in the right, that he meant what he said, and that he's going to renew the whole world. Quite possibly, not all Jews believe this, through a Messiah who will come and do justice and re-establish the temple in Jerusalem so that God will come back and live there gloriously, etc. So Paul is living with that narrative, and in particular within that. And you see this in the later rabbis, but it's clearly there in Maccabees as well. There are two figures from the ancient world, the ancient Jewish world, who Paul is identifying with, Elijah and Phinehas. They are the great messengers of zeal, if you like. Bad things are happening. We've got to do some sacred violence to stamp out the nonsense and get Israel back on track. And Paul is role modeling Phinehas and Elijah, and the texts which embody their stories are clearly present.
And he was very much part of this movement, wanting to keep the law better so that we hasten on this eventual...
And let's be quite clear, this is not, as used to be said in Protestant rhetoric, about earning my ticket to heaven or doing enough good works so that God will be pleased with me. It's God wants to renew and restore this world, and for the sake of that, he's called Israel to be his special people, his holy people, and so it's for the sake of God's purposes they have to do this and make more and more Jews do this stuff. So here's this bunch who are letting the side down and going off after a crucified Messiah. Who ever heard such nonsense? So Paul is off to do the Phinehas thing, the Elijah thing. These are like the new prophets of Baal, and we know what we have to do with them. And then, if you're in that mode, how do you pray? We know from everything Paul says, he was a person suffused with prayer, and there are standard Jewish prayers. And it's a guess, but I'm not the only one to make this guess, that on the road to Damascus he was meditating, like many people in his tradition did, on the throne chariot in the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, where the prophet sees the whirling wheels and then the chariot, and then his eye is raised up and he sees the figure sitting on the throne and he falls down, crash, as though dead, and then the prophet is commissioned, etc. I think Paul was meditating on the throne chariot, longing to get a glimpse of the God he'd worshipped all his life. And I think he gets to that glimpse, and it's Jesus of Nazareth. And simultaneously, all his life is fulfilled and all his life is shattered. And that is just the most devastating and the most fulfilling moment. And in a sense, he spends the rest of his life working out what that means and encouraging other people to explore with him what I wouldn't want to say forcing them to do and believe what, because you can't force people to do and believe that kind of stuff, but helping them to share the sense that Jesus really is Israel's Messiah.
Lots of people have given different explanations for what happened to Paul. Psychological, some epileptic fit, maybe, who knows. Where do you go as a historian, Tom Holland, with this obviously very significant event that I think you'd agree there's some historical basis to, that something happened on the road to Damascus? What do you think happened, though, in your view?
I think in the broadest context, Paul is negotiating a tension that is inherent within the understanding of the God of Israel, because he is on the one hand the God of Israel, and he is on the other hand the creator of the entire world. So how do you negotiate that tension? Yes. And in the globalizing world of the Roman Empire in which many Jews live, this becomes a particularly pressing issue.
How do you live in the wider diaspora?
Yes. So to what extent is God also the creator of, of the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians and whoever? I mean, this is a kind of somewhere and anywhere kind of question that we were talking about earlier. We still have today, and I would suspect that Paul is struggling to negotiate that as a Greek-speaking Pharisee. What persuades him to think the things that he does, I think, is profoundly mysterious. And I have no doubt that he did think that he had seen Jesus. I mean, I can't think of any other reason that would explain why he does what he does. And I mean, it's mysterious in two ways, really. One is that he chucks over what presumably would have been a very comfortable career to essentially embark on a life as a kind of wandering bum who is going to face repeated beatings, shipwrecks, and ultimately face death. And the other is why it would ever cross his mind that in some way a crucified criminal is a part of the one God of Israel. And the strange thing about all his letters is that although he's arguing repeatedly for his understanding of who Jesus is and how he should be understood and how he should be comprehended, I mean, I may be corrected on this, but I don't think at any point does he feel the need to actually argue that Jesus is in some way a part of God. I mean, this is just taken for granted, and everyone seems to understand this.
And it used to be so, and when you had Larry Hurtado on the show, you presumably discussed these kinds of things. It used to be thought that Jesus only was regarded as fully divine much later, like the end of the first generation or even early second century, only at the end of the New Testament period. And I think now most New Testament scholars are convinced that actually this is on the table from the beginning, and it's taken for granted in Galatians, which I think is Paul's earliest letter.
And the strangeness of that is something that we perhaps are kind of immune to, because it's in the Bible, so you read it, but you think, why would he think this?
Yeah.
Why would anyone
context,
think this?
It's a very strange thing for a devout Jew to have thought.
But I would guess. I mean, I can't remember whether you say this in your biography, because I read it in proof. But having had presumably this kind of convulsive experience, presumably then he turns to Scripture to try and work out what's happened.
Yeah, to try and process.
And essentially he reads through all the passages and kind of constructs this theology.
Yes, I think one of the things we fail to realize often in modern Western Christianity, never mind the secular world, is the stories that people had in their heads about what God was going to do. And particularly the end of the book of Ezekiel, hugely important, and parallels in Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 40 and 52, God's promise that he will one day come back visibly in person to dwell in the temple, to rescue his people, to do what has to be done, etc., etc. And those promises are kind of shimmering in the background. And some people in the Jewish world, like the author of the book we call Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus, seems to think that this sort of has happened because wisdom has come to dwell in the temple in the form of the teaching of Torah. Now, most Jews in Paul's day, I don't think, believed that. They still thought there was something major yet to happen. And it is as though with Paul, and indeed with the Gospels, it isn't just that they are telling Jesus stories and somehow saying, by the way, there's another dimension to this. They are telling the story which was Israel's story about God coming back, but the only way they can tell it is by talking about Jesus. So it's not just a Jesus story with a God dimension. It's actually the God story with a Jesus focus.
Yeah.
And it's hard for us to realize that because the last 200 years, philosophically, theologically, we haven't been there. So when I then look at how Paul is handling Isaiah, how he's handling the passages about the new Exodus with the pillar of of cloud and fire coming, only now it's Jesus and the Spirit. You see, he's drawing on Jewish traditions about the presence and saving power of God. And then, of course, they all get focused, not least on that middle chunk of Isaiah, where you get the so-called suffering servant. And the suffering servant seems to be God saying, actually, when you look to see what it's like when I come back to rescue you, oh my goodness, it's going to be like this. And we see Jewish exegetes at the time struggling with Isaiah 53, some of them thinking it's a Messiah, but actually the suffering is what he inflicts on other people, and other people thinking, no, it's his real suffering, but it's the martyrs, it's not the Messiah. And Jesus, and then Paul picking this up, seem to have fused these two together with this extraordinary notion of a suffering Messiah who turns out to be the personal embodiment of Israel's God. And and then we see this already by early on in Paul, woven into fresh prayings of central Jewish prayers. The famous one in 1 Corinthians 8, where it's, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In Greek, Kyrios, ho theos, hemon, Kyrios, hisestin. And Paul astonishingly finds Jesus inside that. So he says, for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, we to him, and one Lord, Jesus the Messiah, through whom are all things. So you've got, he's theos, kai, he's Kyrios, but it's God and Jesus. So at the heart of Jewish monotheism, Paul finds this bifurcation.
And in a sense, that's a massive transformation, but at the same time, somehow for Paul, it is a fulfillment.
It's a fulfillment.
It's not.
It's a final revelation, because he then, obviously, looks back and says, oh my goodness, we now read the scriptures with this in mind. He is the image of the invisible God. So when humans were made in God's image, he is the image in whom we were made, and so on.
And just how strange would this idea of a God who, or a Messiah or whatever, who becomes crucified have been in the Roman world that this message was being delivered into?
Beyond weird. Totally beyond weird, as Paul repeatedly says. I mean, he says that it's
foolishness,
a scandal, it's
to
an
the
outrage,
Gentiles.
it's foolishness, it's ridiculous, and he's aware of this the whole time.
Just how embarrassing this is, in a sense.
Well, it is kind of, I mean, and that is the whole point.
Yes.
That to suffer death on a cross is, it's the worst death that the Roman state can inflict, but it is also shaming in the context of the Mosaic law, which also says that to be hung from a tree is a cause of
being cursed.
And we often forget with our stylized depictions of the crucifixion just how gory and shameful it was.
Absolutely. And so what is happening is that it's like it's the ultimate judo throw, where you turn the strength of your opponent against him. The Roman power is affirmed by brutality. The governor of a province has the right to burn, to throw to beasts, to crucify anyone who he feels is a danger to Roman power. And governors did that absolutely at the drop of a hat. So what is happening with Paul's proclamation of the one God in some way suffering this fate is to absolutely upend the very fabric and basis, not just of Roman power, but of power full stop. Because, of course, the assumption through, from reading the Jewish scriptures was that God is a warrior, and that God will, the overthrow of Roman power, the establishment of a kingdom of peace will in some way be affected by the sword. And what Paul is saying is that actually the true source of power is to suffer. And that notion, that to be a victim can somehow be a source of power is unbelievably subversive in the context of classical antiquity.
And still today, to some extent. I mean, it's not as though we all believe that today.
Although you see all the time in the news at the moment that to cast yourself as a victim is somehow to give yourself power. And you would only have power by virtue of being a victim if you existed in the context of a society that was still in its fundamentals Christian.
Yes.
In the Roman world, if you said, I'm a victim, they'd say, yeah, and I'll enslave you.
Yes, exactly. Thanks very much.
Or I'll rape you, I'll do whatever.
Right.
I mean,
and on top of this was also this statement, which I think was being used in quite a political way, of Jesus is Lord, which was obviously set against the idea that Caesar is Lord.
So if we think of Paul arriving in Galatia, it would seem that in some way the Galatians feel that they have a particular relationship to the figure of Augustus. So they transcribe the Res Gestae, his account of his achievements. And it seems to have been done to a far greater degree than anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And so they are inscribing this idea of Augustus, who describes himself as Divi Filius, son of God, son of Caesar, but he's been raised up to the heavens. He is a prince of peace. He has established a universal amity across the world, and this is euangelion. This is good news. This is a gospel to be proclaimed. But the statues of Augustus, the Res Gestae of Augustus, the very essence of Augustus is that the peace that he has brought has been brought by a sword. He is an imperator. He is a general who is victorious. This is what an emperor is. And so in the cities that Paul is arriving at, this cult of Caesar, which is the fastest growing cult probably in history up until that point. It's spread like wildfire. And it's not a kind of frigid cult. It's a cult that people across the Roman world invest in with a deep emotional sense. This idea of a conquering human who is divine, who has risen from the earth and gone to the heavens. He is the epitome of earthly power and therefore of divine power as well. And so in that context, the subversion that Paul is effecting by turning up and saying, actually, the Son of God that I preach is someone who was crucified by Roman power. I mean, it kind of makes you wince.
But why did it work then? Why did anyone listen to such a crazy message?
That's a great question. I mean, I just want to endorse everything that Tom said. I think this, it is one of the most extraordinary turnarounds in history that the symbolism of crucifixion said, we run this world and if you get in our way, we'll rub you out. And that is callous, brutal power. And then to have within 20 years the crucifixion as a symbol of all-conquering, self-giving love, that's just quite extraordinary. And as you said, we in the modern Christian world see crucifixes, we have them, as jewelry decoration or nice pretty things in churches. And actually this was like an electric chair or a horrible gallows or something. So why did it work? And I think if we'd asked Paul that, he would have said, because when you announce the crucified Jesus as Lord, there is a strange power, which he sometimes calls the gospel and sometimes calls the Spirit, and that power goes to work in people's minds and hearts, and stuff happens. They find themselves gripped and grasped by it. And I think Paul would have said, there is no logical explanation. Of course there is. Nobody actually wants to sign off this. But it's, I mean, everything that Tom Holland was saying just now was reminding me of Mark 8, where Jesus says, we're going to Jerusalem and it's all going to happen. And if you want to come after me, you've got to be prepared to die, take up your cross as well. I think they thought that was a metaphor. But in fact, Jesus really meant it. And then in Mark 10, when he says, don't you realize, when James and John want to sit in the best seats, to be his right and left-hand men, and he says, don't you realize the rulers of the nations bully people and harry people and lord it? We're not going to do it like that. We're going to do it the other way. Anyone who wants to be great must be your servant. Because the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus himself is precisely articulating the redefinition of power with the cross at the center of that. And Paul picks up from that and says that, and I think this is what Paul would actually want to say. First, on the cross, Jesus did in fact defeat the principalities and powers. He says that 2 or 3 passages. He disarmed the powers and made a public example. Of course, it didn't look like that. This is the theological interpretation in the light of the resurrection. But then when you've got that interpretation, you can go to work and say, now, actually, Jesus crucified is the fulcrum around which world history turns, and people find that it's true for them.
I mean, this brings us to that interesting tension that you sit in a sense, as both a believer and a historian of the scriptures, Tom Wright, because in a sense you're saying Paul, the explanation Paul would have given is that something supernatural happened. This gospel changed people. Or are you? And are you allowed to, as a historian, to say?
It'll be interesting to see what happens when Tom Holland gets past Galileo and on into the 18th and 19th century, because this word supernatural has changed its meaning.
Okay.
The word supernatural in the Middle Ages, as far as I understand it, meant a superabundance of godness over and on top of, but not excluding what goes on. So it's what normally goes on plus some extra dimensions. But from the 18th century onwards, something very interesting happened culturally, and the ancient philosophy called Epicureanism really became the dominant philosophy of the West. And with Epicureanism, the gods and our world are totally separate. They're made of the same stuff. They're made of atoms, but they have nothing to do with us. So supernatural means something out there as opposed to something down here. And then Christians trying to make sense of the faith within a basically Epicurean world think of God, quote, intervening. So you either have natural events or supernatural events. And I resist that dichotomy. I think it's a product of 18th and 19th
this is, of course,
centuries.
if you want more on this, the Gifford lectures that you gave this year.
Thank you, yes.
Are the place to go.
Fluently done.
Very nice, but unfortunately it's going to take a little while before they get published because I've got some work to do, but they are available online.
They're on
actually.
YouTube,
yeah,
you
they
can go
are.
and see them right away.
Yeah, YouTube. Oh, goodness. But the point is this, that we still in our culture, and I think I say this in one of the Giffords actually, the only real question that the great British public know theologically is, does God intervene in the world or doesn't he? Which is why a journalist faced with a new archbishop says, do you believe in the virgin birth and the resurrection? In other words, are you going to be one of those embarrassing fundamentalists who says you believe it all, or are you going to be one of those equally dodgy liberals who says you disbelieve it all? It's a horrible dilemma. And I want to say, wrong question. This is not, for me as a historian, the more I know about history, the more I think, yeah, all sorts of odd things happen in the world. And the idea that everything is just a closed continuum is a very particular philosophical thing. So I want to have it both ways, actually.
How do you approach this? Because we can talk about metaphysical commitments on your part, Tom Holland, but at the end of the day, someone like that you're sitting opposite, like Tom Wright, obviously does believe the Bible to be both a historical document that you can both agree on, you can pull apart and dissect and look at, but is also a source of divine revelation at some level.
Rather as a kind of Darwinian,
right?
In the sense that I assume that Christianity triumphs or achieves what it achieves because it gives something that people want that they hadn't previously been given.
So there's a social
it's the survival of the fittest. So if you, I mean, it's evident for most famously from Paul's stay in Athens that there is in a sense a marketplace for gods in antiquity. So if you think of Paul arriving in Galatia, the Galatian gods are famously horrible. There's one god that supposedly goes around punching women in the breasts, and you think, this is not a kind of particularly pleasant. The other famous deity in Galatia is Cybele, who sits on a mighty mountain, and in the ecstasy of their worship, men will castrate themselves in her honor. And Paul kind of makes a grim joke about this in Galatians, saying, his opponents, I wish that they would castrate themselves.
Cut the whole lot off.
So these are kind of, these are intimidating gods. These are gods who certainly don't love you. Maybe you're a philosopher and you look at the god of Aristotle, the fixed mover.
I mean, there was a kind of,
you have to love this fixed mover, but there's no implication at all.
And if there was a relationship, it was quite transactional. It was sort of keep them happy, and then we can get on with our lives.
Yes, and that is also true of Divi Filius Augustus. This is also a kind of transactional relationship. We'll worship him, and then please don't come and kill us. Now, so in that context, the God of the Jews, it provokes a lot of mockery, a lot of kind of contempt, but also a fair degree of envy, because actually I think it's pretty clear that there are lots of people in the Greco-Roman world who are quite jealous of this idea of a God who loves the Jews and who particularly cares for them and who would like to be a bit of that. And so you have these kind of liminal figures who, they're Gentiles, but they kind of would like to have a part of this kind of Jewish vibe. And in that context, Paul turning up and saying, you don't have to give up, Paul. You don't have to be circumcised. And this God loves you as he loves me.
You can see why that would have been attractive.
I think you can absolutely see why that would be attractive. And I think that clearly this does cut through to people who are relatively prosperous, and Paul mentions them in his letters. Women as well as men who can provide him with funding and with backing. But it must also have given. I mean, what the impact it must have had on slaves to be told that you are one with the free. To be told, a slave in Rome, in the household of a Christian, to be told you are a child of God at a time where Nero is absolutely in his pomp, and Nero is kind of dramatizing what it is to be a son of a son of a god in the Augustan sense, to an astonishingly histrionic degree. For a slave in some attic in the suburbs of Rome to be told that, I mean, it's just been overwhelming.
It is short, and also for women. And it's a point Rodney Stark makes in his book, The Rise of Christianity, and I think it needs to be drawn out, particularly in today's culture. But that the valuing of women, there is no male and female in Galatians 3. That is almost unthinkable in a post-Aristotle world where men and women are almost different species, and who's in charge here, and then when you see the way that Paul treats his female co-workers, and the way that when he's written this extraordinary letter called Romans, one of the most amazing pieces of writing in the ancient world, he entrusted to Phoebe, who is a deacon in the church in Cenchreae. She takes it to Rome, and I'd be interested to know Tom Holland's take on this, but my understanding is that when you give a letter to somebody to take to somebody, to a group, she is likely to be the person who reads it out and quite possibly explains it. Maybe the first person.
There is another brilliant book that I'm sure you're aware of by Paula Gooder on this very subject, her novelization of the Phoebe story.
I know of that. I'm very proud of Paula. She's a former student of mine, and I'm looking forward to reading that book. Yes.
Well, I had her on Unbelievable with
right.
a rather different, interlocutor. That was Francesca Stavrakopoulou. Opposite.
Yeah, she doesn't like Paul.
well, she likes Paula because funnily enough, Francesca was a student of Paula's herself.
Right. Okay.
So yes, it's the world of biblical scholarship.
So I mean, I'm very much interested and would like to press this further, because I do totally agree that this idea that you can all be one, there is a new community, and you are loved and valued. And I was thinking about this in relation to forgiveness the other day, that the ancient gods didn't forgive people. I mean, Zeus and Poseidon and co. You might be able to placate them. You might be able to sneak round when they weren't watching. But the idea they would forgive you is quite different. I don't think you find that in the Greco-Roman world. And people didn't, as far as I know, reckon that they were going around needing forgiveness in that sense.
But I'm still confused at one level as to, I mean, I accept that there's this thesis, okay, the reason it caught on was because it allowed slaves to suddenly feel like there were people who maybe wanted in on this. But at the same time, you make very clear in the book, Tom, just how socially inconvenient it was to become a Christian.
It's massively socially
it's not
inconvenient.
like this is a way to climb the ladder.
I mean, no, absolutely not. And this is part of the problem all the way through. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul, looking back to the time when they became believers just a few weeks earlier, he says, you turned from idols to serve a living and true God. Now, it's hard for us to imagine what that's like, but an ancient city like Thessalonica or Corinth or Ephesus or anywhere, you've got idol temples on every street corner. You've got processions, you've got games in honor of the Lord God, so-and-so, whatever it is, particularly Lord Caesar. You've got celebrations, regular festivals, regular holidays, and everyone shows up. People are regularly coming through the streets with sacrificial animals. It's what you do. And in a world where there is no such thing as private life, except for the very, very rich, everybody knows if you suddenly aren't showing up. You know, that family down the street, they haven't been to anything this last month. What's going on? Oh, haven't you heard? They've joined this funny new group. Well, who are they? Well, they say they're Jews, but they're not Jews, so we don't know who they are. And so suddenly you're not doing all the things that people in your world normally
you liken
do.
it in the modern world to St. Paul, say, going into Wall Street and sort of saying, right, we've got to abandon all of these financial institutions, the way we run our lives.
Or, you know, I sometimes say to people when people say, why didn't Paul say that slavery was wrong? I say, well, when did you last go into the pulpit on a Sunday morning and say, by the way, it's quite clear that motor cars are polluting our planet and destroying our world, so I want you to leave your cars in the parking lot. We'll have them taken to the dump later on because we're all going to be either walking or on horseback from now on. You know, most congregations would not think that was a very good sermon. But actually, when you're talking about a major social revolution, you're just not going to be doing those processions anymore. And this is why In southern Greece, they get permission to shelter under the Jewish permission because the Jews had permission not to do that stuff. And this is where a lot of the hassle comes from, because then when suddenly there's a bunch of non-Jews claiming the same permission, the authorities want to know who are, and then they'll go around to the Jewish community.
And suddenly this is a bit of
these
a...
people?
This thing's getting out of control.
I think
suddenly.
this is the best explanation for a lot that's going on in Galatians, particularly. And I'm very interested in Tom's.
Well, I mean, I've got a slightly edgier comparison,
Okay,
and
go on.
any comparison between the 21st century and the first century is obviously, they're so different. But if you think about the spread of radical Islam, if you think about the way that people worry about their children or their wives or their sons becoming radicalized, I think you might have some faint echo of how it's working. And we were talking about, Paul's use of letters. Yes. The reason that he can do this, the reason that he can communicate across the Roman world, is because there is an enormous road system which is being used by Caesar and by governors to communicate. It's their gospel. It's the kind of ganglion that's connecting the fabric of the mighty brain of Rome. And Paul is kind of piggybacking on that, rather in the way that Islamic radicals are piggybacking on the internet, which was originally developed by the American
the
defense
internet is our Roman road system of today.
So it's kind of using technology and the infrastructure of a superpower to come up with things that are profoundly opposed to it.
Right.
And in a sense, part of the appeal of radical Islam is precisely that it is subversive of almost everything that people in secular society take for granted.
Interesting point.
I'm not saying that Paul is. I'm not comparing Paul to a kind of ISIS.
But I understand the principle you're employing there. Yeah.
But part of the people say why would anyone run off to Syria? I mean, and sign up to this terrifying cult. In a sense, it's precisely the challenge of it that becomes the appeal. And, Paul talks a lot about the Spirit, and he talks a lot about the Spirit bringing freedom. And that idea of being free in a world where everyone else is not free gives you a kind of dignity and status that in the long run will enable people to suffer torture and even death in the cause of affirming that. And to this extent, I think that that Paul and the early Christians are the ancestors of ISIS and are the ancestors of almost every group that defines themselves in terms of belief, because they're willing to suffer martyrdom for belief. You don't really get, there's the odd, Socrates is kind of an example, but the idea that you as a slave girl or that you are willing to suffer death for a belief, that is really something that originates.
Obviously, there are parallels, and it's very interesting to explore those, and they go back, of course, to the pre-Christian Jewish radical zealots, as in the Maccabean period, who were prepared to die for their hope that God was going to renew the world, and you see that in the book called Second Maccabees, particularly.
Although, that is also about kind of defending land, though, isn't it?
So that's always defending land, re-establishing the temple, etc., etc., etc. Sure, yes, but what we see in Paul is the taking of that radical tradition, which is also a violent tradition. I mean, some of them are martyred, but some of them are going to sharpen their swords and win an extraordinary battle. And in the 2nd century AD, you see this with the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135. We have a brief little messianic kingdom of Judea under the rule of this man, the son of the star, and they are going to have, they think, an astonishing military victory over the Romans. So that continues on. What you see in Paul has all of that energy, but turned upside down, exactly as Tom Holland was saying before, through the notion of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, that this is a different kind of victory, won by a different kind of means. And we see if there is a sense in which Paul is the ancestor of ISIS, Paul is also the ancestor of St. Francis and of Mother Teresa and of the people who are saying, no, there is a different way to transform the world, and it is the way of love, it's the way of self-giving, and the ancestor of people like Desmond Tutu, who, we forget that in the 70s, Desmond Tutu was standing in front of crowds of angry people, his own people, who wanted to use violence, and he was saying that is not the way we transform the world. And astonishing amazingly, that message got through and won the day, though South Africa is still difficult, but there's a message of love and forgiveness.
Well, I hesitate to bring up the subject of Paul and the law in the presence of Tom Wright. I mean, it's a hubristic thing to do. But Paul is clearly also, I think, the ancestor of the modern notions of international law that ISIS are committed to overthrowing.
Right.
Because what Paul introduces into the bloodstream of the West, and then by extension, because the West spreads those ideas across the world, the entire kind of global framework of how international law is structured, is the idea that God's law can be written on the heart, that you no longer need the Torah, that the Spirit will write it on the heart, and therefore you will know what is right, and that will be illumined. And so what that gives in the long run the West is a notion that law can be human and be morally valid. And that's the great contrast with the Islamic world, where law is, in the sense of the Torah and the Talmud, Sharia is about the idea of God having directly revealed kind of legal rulings.
Which have to be imposed on people whether they like it or not.
Whereas in the West, the idea that law can be something that is of human origin is absolutely taken for granted.
Right.
And so this is kind of the great gripe that Islamic radicals have with international law, is precisely that they recognize its Christian origins. So there's a guy, Al-Makdisi, a Palestinian Jordanian radical who was hugely influential intellectually on ISIS and on Al-Qaeda, and he detests Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is part of the United Nations, and he's saying, well, the Charter of the United Nations is of human origin, it is not of divine origin. So essentially his argument is with the Pauline idea that...
That is fascinating, and it goes. I mean, obviously that's an ancient Jewish idea. The writing of the law on the heart is Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and it fits with this whole idea that basically Pauline Christianity is, to coin an odd phrase, Judaism for the masses. I mean, Nietzsche said it was Platonism for the masses. That's absolutely wrong. In the 19th century, many Christians were Platonists, and that's a problem. But the idea that this Jewish insight about a loving God who will inscribe the law on the hearts of his people, and now this can happen to anyone.
Just as liberalism is Christianity for the masses.
In a sense, up to a point, Lord Copper. Yeah, no, let's not go there. But then what we get with that, with Paul, this extraordinary thing, which when I was writing this book, it impinged on me again, that what we already see when there's a rumor that there's going to be a famine coming, the church in Antioch instantly, instead of stockpiling food, they said, we've got to help them down in Jerusalem. And you have a sense of a translocal community as well as a trans-ethnic community in a way which I think is unprecedented in the ancient world. The Jewish communities, the synagogue communities, were translocal. They were across the world, and they sort of knew about one another and were in touch with one another. But it was basically Jews and proselytes or God-fearers or whoever. And there were translocal communities of the Roman imperial administration and the Roman army, but that was all jolly well loyal to Caesar, thank you very much. What you have in Christianity is a community which Paul insists is one. It's a united community and has to be struggled for that unity. And that's precisely the origin of the United Nations. That's a Christian Pauline idea. The problem is if you try to get it without the roots in an explicit belief in this particular God who has rescued the world in this particular way, well, you can see, go to the UN today, you can whistle for it because it's falling apart, because we've tried to get it without the basis.
Going to have to leave it there. I wish we had more time, but thank you so much, gentlemen, both, Tom Holland and Tom Wright, for joining me on the programme today. Tom Holland, we want you back when your book is available, and we'll get you in another interesting discussion about it. Tom Wright, I'm looking forward to, we've got a little bit of a plan in the pipeline for a regular podcast with you, so watch this space if you're a Tom Wright fan. You might be able to get more of conversations like this coming to you in the future, but for the moment, thank you both for being with me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.